So I will try to use my teaching voice. We started classes back last week, but the microphone certainly helps. Thank you, Anne, for that introduction and for asking me to do this. And I appreciate Nora and the Cumberland River Compact for also allowing me to come and speak about Andrew Jackson and for providing such a beautiful space. I'm going to talk about Jackson and his influence on helping Tennessee become more prominent during the antebellum period. And I'm going to do that by looking at three sets of men who supported Jackson, or at least many of them supported Jackson throughout most of his career, and you'll see why I'm phrasing it that way in a few minutes. These are men whose names you're probably familiar with, and I may not tell you anything new about those men, but hopefully you'll get a better sense of how instrumental Jackson was in helping these men achieve prominence, and in doing so, helping Tennessee to achieve prominence in the years leading up to the Civil War. I'm going to start with John Eaton and William B. Lewis. And before I talk about these two men, I want to just speak briefly about one of the perspectives that I take in Andrew Jackson, Southerner. If you look at Jackson's life, one of the keys to his success was kinship. It was the use of not just family, but marital relations, and then young men or men around his age who fought under him or who were in some way connected to him, using those ties to advance himself both politically and economically and socially. And when we talk about kinship, we typically do think about family. We think about the blood relatives, or we think about marital relations, if you claim your in-laws, that is, which I do personally. We think about kinship in that way. But there's a third level of kinship that's extremely important for someone like Jackson. And it's extremely important for Jackson because he had lost, as many of you probably know, he had lost his immediate family members at the time he was born, and then within the next 13 years or so during the Revolution. So his father died around the time that he was born. His mother and two brothers died during the Revolution. So while Jackson has cousins and aunts and uncles, he does not seem to be particularly close to them once he leaves the Waxhaw region where he grew up. So his immediate blood ties are very tenuous from the time he's 13 or 14 until he dies in 1845. Well, then he moves, as many of you know, to Middle Tennessee, and he happens to marry into the Donaldson family, which was a very good choice. And when I talk about Jackson, I'm very careful to say that I do believe Andrew and Rachel loved one another. So do not mistake me. I think it is a love story. I think it is phenomenal that these two individuals seem to love each other up until the time Rachel died. And for Jackson, after her death, the grieving process that he had for the next 17 years was fairly significant. So, even though there is this love story, I think Jackson also had a sense that the Donaldson family could help him get ahead. That there were enough Donaldson family members, the Donaldson family was prominent enough in its background, and certainly being one of the first two families to settle Middle Tennessee, or white families to settle Middle Tennessee, that he sees that there's some advantage to hooking up with, well, let me rephrase that. My students tell me there's a different definition for hooking up. For marrying into the Donaldson clan. These young people today, I tell you. So in any case, you have blood relations, you have marital relations, but then there's this third category of kinship, and this is something called fictive kinship, and this is very important for Jackson. Fictive kinship is a type of kinship in which you identify with people who are not blood or marital relations. You identify with them as family. So the example that I often use is that when our two youngest, or our two daughters were younger, there was a woman in our church who we were not related to in any way, but she was very much like a grandmother to them. They called her Grammy. She spoiled them to no end. And so that is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a relationship where you're not related in any blood or marital way, yet you consider each other family. And so the men I'm talking about today, I think, fit into that category. They're not necessarily related to Jackson, although Andrew Jackson Donaldson, whom I'll talk about in a minute, is. But many of them are not related to him, but they are people whom he considered kin. They were like sons to him. And so that is a very important part, or a very important context to understand as I talk about these men. So having prefaced that, let me talk about John Eaton and William B. Lewis. These two men were men who became attached to Jackson most significantly during the War of 1812. John Eaton fought under Jackson. William B. Lewis was a quartermaster for Jackson. And from that point on until Jackson's presidency, these are two men who were very close to Jackson. They also happened to be brothers-in-law. They both married sisters. Those two sisters happened to die and the two men remarried, but they were initially brothers-in-law. These two men were the two main individuals who governed and who directed and strategized for Jackson during his presidential campaigns in 1824 and in 1828. The way that I describe John Eaton, who was a U.S. Senator when Jackson ran in 1824, the way that I describe them is like this. John Eaton was the campaign manager. Now, understand in the 1820s, they don't have campaign managers the same way that we have them today. But he is essentially the de facto campaign manager. He is the one who is helping Jackson develop strategy. He's the one who is making sure Jackson doesn't, write a nasty letter or issue a duel, challenge to a duel or something like that. Eaton also helps Jackson to correspond with other men around the country in order to promote Jackson's candidacy. Because as a presidential candidate at this time, you were not supposed to go out and campaign openly for yourself. And there are times when you kind of wish, boy, those were the good old days, right? If only, anyway. So Eaton is a very important man in Jackson's life. He has the Tennessee and the Nashville connections. He's part of that Jackson's inner circle, but he also has the Washington connection because he's a U.S. Senator. So that's Eaton. And then you have William B. Lewis, who I'd like to describe as the G. Gordon Liddy of the Jackson campaign. And many of you are of the age where you know exactly who I'm talking about. My freshman students just look at me like I'm speaking Greek. G. Gordon Liddy, is that a rapper? No. So William B. Lewis is the man who's more behind the scenes, who is willing to do some of the dirty work for the Jackson campaign that some of the other Jackson men don't want to do, or they're happy to foist off on him. So he will come up with dirt or on gossip on political enemies, or he will try to manipulate situations so that it makes Jackson look better and someone like John Quincy Adams look worse, or Henry Clay look worse. So these two men are extremely close to Jackson during the 24 and the 28 campaigns. Both of these men, by the time Jackson leaves office in 1837, both of these men will be on the outs with Jackson. Eaton, Eaton more so, a little bit more so than Lewis. And that's one of the things about Jackson's life that is a common theme, is that he was extremely loyal to people. He was extremely loyal to men who were loyal to him. But if you happen to show disloyalty, you could find yourself on the outskirts. You could find yourself pushed out of that inner circle. So even though that happens later, once Jackson's president, these two men are essential, I would argue, for helping Jackson to become president. Again, because Jackson can't go out and campaign for himself. He has to have these two men. And these are not the only two. We're going to look at some other men as well. But to me, these are the key cogs for Jackson and his campaign to become president in 24 and then successfully in 28. So, The next three men I wanted to talk about, two of them are probably very familiar to you, maybe not Andrew Jackson Donaldson as much. These three men are important in Jackson's life because they are men who are much younger than Jackson. They are men whom Jackson takes under his wings, and they are men who become very important to helping Jackson implement or to see come to fruition his vision of manifest destiny. Manifest destiny, if you're not familiar with the term, was the belief that God had given the North American continent to the United States, and that the United States not only had been given this land, this territory, but it was a God-given directive that the United States spread out, that it take control of this land. Jackson is a firm believer in manifest destiny. When you go back and you look at his early years in Tennessee, when he sees the expansion of white settlement as absolutely crucial to the future, not just of Tennessee, but also of the United States. When you look at his operations during the War of 1812, if you're not familiar with that war, we're celebrating the bicentennial at the moment. If you're not familiar with that war, Jackson actually spends most of his time during the War of 1812 fighting Native Americans, not fighting the British. We celebrate or commemorate at least the Battle of New Orleans, and we'll do the bicentennial of that in January. So we talk a lot about that. And, Johnny Horton, I think, is probably responsible for a lot of that for my father, my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation. But Jackson spends a lot more time fighting Native Americans. And part of the reason for that is because he envisions a future in which the United States will expand into the Deep South, and there's a major obstacle there. And that obstacle is the various Indian groups, particularly the Creek, who stand in the way. And so he spends an inordinate amount of time focusing on that, focusing on implementing his vision of manifest destiny during the War of 1812 and in the years after that. So once Jackson becomes president, he also follows this policy of manifest destiny, and one of his main areas of focus was Texas, which was part of the Mexican government, or part of the Spanish Empire, then part of the Mexican government, and then by the time Jackson leaves office, of course, Texas had won its independence. So during his presidential administrations, Jackson would have liked to have seen Texas become part of the United States. After he leaves office, he wants to see Texas become part of the United States. And in fact, the last year or so of his life is spent, a large part of that is spent writing about and corresponding about and talking about trying to get Texas into the United States. So, having provided some of the context, let me talk about each one of these individuals and the role that they play. Sam Houston, of course, was a man who had fought under Jackson, had actually been injured during one of the battles in 1814. Houston would eventually become a lawyer. He had a law office in Lebanon, Tennessee, where Cumberland University is, where I teach. He would then enter the U.S. House of Representatives and would eventually become governor. By the time Jackson was in office, or by the time Jackson was elected, Houston was governor. Houston will be a major player in helping the United States to achieve its goal of annexing Texas. I won't get into all the details of why Houston leaves the governorship. He resigns the governorship prematurely. He moves west, spends some time with the Cherokee, and then eventually makes his way to Texas and plays a prominent role in the Texas Revolution, and then becomes president of the independent Republic of Texas. Houston is a key ally for Jackson in this goal of manifest destiny. And even though Jackson doesn't achieve the annexation of Texas during his presidency, he and Houston correspond frequently throughout Jackson's retirement years about what Jackson sees as the necessity of Texas joining the Union. And so let me talk about each one of these men individually, and then I'll try to put them together with Jackson to help you understand how this idea of manifest destiny works. The second man I want to talk about is James K. Polk. James K. Polk becomes one of Jackson's proteges in the 1820s. When Polk enters the U.S. House, he does so at the expense of Andrew Irwin, who is one of Jackson's sworn enemies. Jackson and Andrew Irwin had been business partners or had been involved in some business deals in the 18-teens. They had had a falling out, and the two men, Jackson and Irwin, hate one another. So one of the best ways to endear yourself to Jackson was to be one of his enemies, and so Polk does that, and so that sort of brings him into Jackson's orbit. And Polk is a firm believer in many of the same principles that Jackson believes in. And in fact, up until the time Jackson dies, I think he and Polk are very much in tune as far as their ideological and political principles. There's a reason Polk is called Young Hickory. It wasn't just a nickname, it was an identification with Old Hickory. In any case, Polk will be in the U.S. House he's elected to 7 terms. In the mid-1830s, he will run for the speakership of the U.S. House. He will lose in 1834, much to Jackson's chagrin, and I'll talk more about why Jackson was particularly upset about that in a few minutes. And then in 1835, Polk runs for the speakership again, and he wins election at that point. And he will serve throughout the rest of Jackson's term into Van Buren's presidency. So Polk is a key, even before he becomes Speaker of the House, he's a key ally for Jackson in the U.S. House. He is someone Jackson can count on. He is someone Jackson can rely on when it comes to trying to convince congressmen to pass legislation that Jackson wants to see passed. The third man is Andrew Jackson Donaldson, and the last name tips you off. He is a part of this large Donaldson family that Jackson marries into. Donaldson is a nephew, one of several nephews named Andrew Jackson. If you ever do genealogy on the Jackson/Donaldson families, one of the frustrations you will run into is that they all name, or they seemingly name children after Andrew and Rachel. And at some point they kind of all merge together until you pull them apart. But in any case, Andrew Jackson Donaldson was a young man by the time Jackson was elected. He had gone to law school, he had been at West Point and had served a short time in the Army. And in 1824, when Jackson first ran for the presidency, Donaldson had come back to Nashville, had very briefly practiced law, but then he had basically would spend the next 21 years devoted to helping his uncle in his various political endeavors. So by the time Jackson becomes president, Donaldson is not a significant player in as far as being part of the inner circle making major decisions with Jackson. But he is an important player because he is someone who is Jackson's private secretary. So he knows the ins and outs of what's going on, even if he doesn't have a lot of input. By the time of the mid-1840s, 1844, 1845, Donaldson is a major player in this policy of manifest destiny that Jackson wants to see implemented. All right, so how is that? Well, Jackson's in Nashville. Houston is in Texas. In the late summer of 1844, President John Tyler appoints Andrew Jackson Donaldson to be the charge d'affaires, or the official American diplomat from the United States to Texas. Now, Donaldson had no previous diplomatic experience. And as much as I like Donaldson, I wrote a book on him, so I kind of have some fond feelings toward him. Despite that, I do not think he was qualified for that position. And I firmly believe the only reason he was appointed was because he was Jackson's nephew, and Jackson and Houston were close friends, and he could serve as a conduit between Jackson and Houston to try to bring about annexation. So Donaldson is sent to Texas, and when you read through his correspondence, and Houston's and Jackson's correspondence as well, what you see is Jackson and Houston do write each other directly occasionally, but oftentimes those letters are passed through Donaldson. And so Donaldson hand delivers a letter to Houston and tells him, you know, my uncle wants you to read this. He emphasizes that Texas needs to become part of the United States, and so on and so forth. And then Houston would, of course, send his letter back, oftentimes through Donaldson. So why is that important? Well, it's important because even though Jackson's not the president, he is the chief statesman of the Democratic Party. And even though John Tyler is not a Democrat at that point, he and Jackson agree on the fact that annexation has to take place. They want to see it happen. And then Tyler's successor, James K. Polk, who will bring about the fruition of annexation, obviously is very close to Jackson. And even though Jackson dies in June of 45, Polk has already been given his marching orders, which he doesn't really need them very much, because Jackson wanted to see annexation take place, and Polk firmly believed in that as well. So when you look at these three men and their connection to Jackson, what you find, I think, is that Jackson is able to influence the conversation and the debate about annexation through these three men pretty directly. In the case of Houston and Donaldson, extremely directly, and Polk less so, but again, I don't think he has to say very much to Polk because they do believe in pretty much the same things. And then the final pair I want to talk about are John Bell and Hugh Lawson White. And these two men represent what I mentioned a few minutes ago. These are men who were Jackson allies. I wouldn't necessarily call them proteges in the sense that Polk and Houston and Donaldson were, but they're allies. They're pretty strong allies for a number of years. But these are men who, once Jackson becomes president, they slowly begin to drift away from Jackson because of policy differences and some personal animosity. And by the time Jackson leaves office, these are two men who are at odds with Jackson. So I want to talk a little bit about their backgrounds and then talk about how that break occurs. John Bell and Hugh Lawson White. Hugh Lawson White is from East Tennessee, not necessarily my old stomping grounds because he's from the Knoxville area, but close enough, East Tennessee. They're two men who very early on in the late 18-teens and early 1820s become part of the Jackson presidential campaign, trumpeting him as the presidential candidate. And in fact, Hugh Lawson White and Jackson went back even years before that. You can go back to the 1790s with those two men and see that they have a fairly close relationship. Jackson makes a comment, in fact, when he steps down from the court, the Superior Court in 1804, 1805, he wants Hugh Lawson White to be his successor. So that gives you some indication of their relationship. So in any case, these are two men who are on board with Jackson, on board with the idea of him becoming president. And once Jackson becomes president, these are two men whom Jackson believes he can count on. They're both in Congress. You know, these are going to be allies like James K. Polk and other people that Jackson thinks he can rely on, or believes he can rely on. Unfortunately for Jackson, or maybe I should say unfortunately for Bell and White, I'm not sure how to phrase that exactly, there is a break between these two men and Jackson. The break centers in large part on the belief that Jackson favors other men over them, and that their careers cannot advance if they continue to remain in Jackson's shadow, that they're going to have to break out from under Jackson in order to achieve something more than what they had achieved. There's also, in the case of Hugh Lawson White, a little bit of added personal animosity, because when Jackson was forming his cabinet, his original cabinet in 1829, he was trying to decide who to appoint to the Secretary of War position. And his two final choices were either John Eaton, his unofficial campaign manager, or Hugh Lawson White. And Jackson sort of threw that decision back to those two men to figure out for themselves. He wanted someone who was close to him in the cabinet, someone from Tennessee who was close to him in the cabinet, but he didn't make a decisive choice. And Eaton, who was in him, he manipulated White into thinking that Jackson preferred him. And so White stepped back and said, well, if Jackson prefers you, then you should have it. And so Eaton gets the Secretary of War position. And even though White had deferred and said, well, go ahead and take it, there's a little bit of resentment there that bubbles up later in Jackson's presidency. And if you think about, if you know the story about what happened with Eaton, If you think about that scandal that John Eaton becomes involved in when he marries Margaret Eaton, the Washington socialite, and then there are these rumors that they had an affair, that her husband had killed himself because he found out, and all that sex scandal that explodes during Jackson's first 2.5 years. I've often wondered, and this is just speculation on my part, I've often wondered if Jackson looked back at that and said, maybe I should have chosen white. Particularly when Eaton eventually abandoned the Democratic Party and joined the Whig Party, which is exactly what Hugh Lawson White and John Bell do in 1834. So it's interesting that Jackson has such strong bonds of loyalty. When you're loyal to him, when you're disloyal, he could turn his back on you. And you see that happen several times with these are just a number of the men who are close to him. I think these are probably the 7 closest in a lot of ways. But you can look at 3 of those men eventually break with Jackson because they have this either personal or political or policy difference with him. So in any case, John Bell in 1834, when he signals his break with Jackson, he does so by running against James K. Polk for the House speakership. Jackson knew that Bell was distancing himself from him, but that was sort of the public signal that, okay, we're not going to be allies anymore. And Jackson is very, very angry that Bell is challenging Polk because Jackson wanted Polk. And he's very satisfied, by the way, the next year when Polk is able to win the speakership. Feels some vindication there. And then Hugh Lawson White, when he abandons the Democratic Party and begins to cast about for another political affiliation, he will join the Whigs as well. And he earns Jackson's ire even more because not only does he abandon the Democrats, join the Whigs, but he also runs for the presidency in 1836 against Jackson's chosen successor, Martin Van Buren, which infuriates Jackson, as you can imagine. Now, White doesn't win, but he is anathema to Jackson from that point on. Jackson is just fed up with White and Bell and some other men who had abandoned him. So I've offered some very brief remarks about these 7 men to give you a sense of what's going on in Jackson's sphere and how those things are affecting the United States and affecting Tennessee. When you look at the careers of these 7 men, John Eaton was already in the U.S. Senate. Several of these men, Polk, Houston, Bell, will become part of Congress during Jackson's rise to power in the mid-1820s. I don't know whether or not these men would have been successful without Jackson. Again, that is something that is just pure speculation. But I think I can pretty confidently say that they would not have achieved the national significance in the way that they did without Jackson. That he is essential to the way that their career paths, the trajectory of their career paths, and the way that it unfolded. So maybe they would have been successful otherwise. Eaton was in the Senate. Would he have become, a prominent member of the Senate? Who knows? Certainly he wouldn't have been part of Jackson's cabinet without Jackson. And I don't think he would have been part of anyone's cabinet, frankly, without Jackson. Would Hugh Lawson White have run for the presidency in 1836? I very seriously doubt it. The Whigs were looking for candidates who could challenge Jackson in certain parts of the country. They nominated 3 through the state legislatures, and Hugh Lawson White was specifically chosen because he was a Tennessean and he could hurt Jackson in Tennessee, or at least that was the calculation. And he does, or he hurts Van Buren, I should say, in Tennessee. So how do these men contribute to Tennessee's significance during the antebellum period? Well, it's pretty clear, I think, with Manifest Destiny. When you have Houston and Donaldson and Polk, when you look at those 3 men, they are crucial to seeing the United States expand westward. And the annexation of Texas, I believe, is one of those dominoes that falls that eventually leads to the Civil War. Without the annexation of Texas, I don't think you have the Mexican-American War. Without that, you don't have the debate over the expansion of slavery in the West. Without that, you don't have this and this and this and this. So I think that's a pretty crucial first domino that Jackson is involved in, even though he's off the scene by June of 45. If you look at the development of the Whig Party, Bell and White are absolutely crucial to that. They are two of the leading members in the South in particular of the Whig Party during its early years. And in fact, Hugh Lawson White will die earlier than John Bell. John Bell's career will extend all the way until the eve of the Civil War. He actually runs for the presidency in 1860 on the Constitutional Union Party ticket. And one of the ironies of that campaign that he runs is that one of his supporters was Andrew Jackson Donaldson, Jackson's nephew, who had himself abandoned the Democratic Party in the mid-1850s, and by 1860 had decided that John Bell wasn't all that bad of a guy, even though I'm sure his uncle was rolling over in his grave. Donaldson and Bell sort of had a meeting of the minds where they saw we need to focus on how do we keep the nation together, which, by the way, was, I think, probably exactly what Jackson would have done if he had been alive at that point.